Welcome back to another episode of Dreading, or if this is your first time here, welcome. Today we are going to be covering the case of Cindy James, which has also been referred to as the case of the Invisible Man. This case came highly requested by multiple of my subscribers, and members of my own family approached me about covering this case. This case is strange, as after hearing all the facts in the case, some people believe no crime was ever committed. My goal, as always, is to present all of the facts in the case that I was able to find, and let you come to your own conclusion. All of my sources will be left in the description box down below. That way you can verify the authenticity of the information I am providing. As always, if there's a video you want me to cover, or a case you want to see have more coverage, let me know in a comment down below, or emailing me at dreading.official@gmail.com. Before we begin, a brief word from our sponsor. Cindy Elizabeth Hack was born June 12, 1944, in Oliver, British Columbia, to parents Matilda and Otto Hack. She was one of 6 children, and like most children being raised in that time frame, her parents believed that they were meant to be seen and not heard. Otto was an incredibly harsh disciplinarian, often taking out any frustration with his children on them physically, erroneously believing that he could beat the bad out of his offspring. Throughout her young life, Cindy tried to stay on Otto's good side, working hard in school and at home to impress her father. However, that was easier said than done. Whenever her father would give her any of his attention, she would boast about the things she had accomplished, how good her grades were in school, and how her teachers were all impressed with her work ethic. But it was rare that these praises came from a third party. After high school, Cindy decided that she was going to become a nurse and dedicate her life to helping others. Like she had done previously, she seemed to thrive in the academic environment, and often told her family how well she was doing. While in nursing school, the rest of her family moved to France, leaving her on her own for the first time in her life. Though she would write them frequently and visit them during the holidays, Cindy would recall this time in her life as being incredibly lonely. That is until she met the man who would become her first fiancé. Cindy met him while studying to be a nurse, as she worked in a hospital as an intern. After working together for some time, this man asked her out, and the two quickly fell in love, spending every waking moment together in amorous bliss. She wrote about him fondly to her parents, telling them how he made her feel like a woman, and how he would be an amazing provider for their future family. In response, her family asked questions about this man, like what was his name, but Cindy never gave that to them, choosing instead to focus on how amazing their life together was, and how he had asked her to marry him. This was big news, and while some members of Cindy's family celebrated, her parents felt odd about it. Why hadn't this person, whoever he was, thought to reach out to get the family's blessings before proposing? Why hadn't he at least reached out to them on his own behalf to try and get to know his new in-laws? And why was Cindy being so cagey whenever they asked for information? Something about this relationship felt odd, but being so far away, they didn't feel comfortable questioning anything too much. Once again, the Hack family told Cindy that they would love to get to know her new fiancé, preferably in person. They asked her to bring him along for the holidays and spend more time together, but she claimed that he was both too busy to leave his work and spending time with his own family. She promised, though, when the two were wed, that they would find some way to divvy up the holidays between their parents. But her relationship with this mystery man would not last. Unfortunately, as another holiday season approached, her future husband and her would get tragic news. The would-be doctor went in for a routine checkup, only to find that he was dying. He was diagnosed with a fast-moving terminal cancer, and that he only had mere months to live. Cindy tried to stay positive during this time, and tried to assure her love that she would stand by him through it all. She believed them to be already married, and that came with the promise of in sickness and in health. She was ready to hold his hand through every treatment. However, that proved to be too much for him. After receiving the diagnosis, the two decided to go on a skiing trip that they had already planned. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway for the pair before their wedding, but now it seemed as if it would be the last trip that they would ever take together. It was on this trip that he would tragically commit suicide, stating that he wanted Cindy to remember him as he was, healthy, vibrant, and so in love with her. And, as you have probably surmised, there was no evidence of this man ever existing, committing suicide in this fashion, or even Cindy being engaged. The only evidence of this man existing was in Cindy's letters to her family, where the details were sparse and inconsistent. Following the death of her unknown fiancé, Cindy met and later married Roy Makepeace, a South African psychiatrist. Roy was 39 years old, 18 years older than Cindy, and by all accounts, the relationship was strenuous. Cindy's family didn't like Roy, as they felt that he had taken advantage of their daughter's gullibility, due in part to her young age. They felt that he manipulated her into a relationship because of her youth and beauty, but over time, as they spent more time with the couple, they thought the pair complemented each other rather well. After 16 years of marriage, Cindy would shock her family by telling them that she was leaving Roy, stating that he had been abusive throughout their relationship. It began with him being withholding towards her if she didn't do something he liked. Roy had a propensity for sailing, which Cindy greatly disliked, as she was terrified of drowning. But when Cindy would tell her husband she didn't want to go sailing with him, he would ignore her for days. After that, she claimed he would strike her in anger when she did something he didn't approve of. Over the course of the marriage, Cindy claimed he had thrown her down the stairs, given her multiple black eyes, which she covered with makeup. As time went on, the abuse got worse, and Cindy had done what she could to hide it from everyone in her life. Coworkers, friends, and family would all claim to have not seen any injuries or signs of discord in the marriage, but no one could be sure what happened behind closed doors. When Makepeace was confronted about these allegations, he admitted to slapping her twice over the course of their marriage, but maintained he was never really physically abusive. When Cindy told her family she was leaving her husband, they supported her wholeheartedly. She had been working as a nurse for years and was well regarded in the area for her competence in the field and her staunch professionalism, so she should have no issues taking care of herself. However, her friends and family made it clear, should she ever need anything, she could always rely on them. They had no way of knowing how necessary their support would actually be. 4 months after her separation from Roy, in September of 1982, Cindy came to her family and told them the alarming news. She suspected that she was being stalked, as in the previous weeks she had seen a person, clad all in black, prowling around her home. When asked to describe this person, Cindy stated that they were definitely male, but otherwise she didn't know. A little over a week later, the prowler began calling Cindy. She described the calls as being graphic, threatening, and perverse, with the man on the other line stating that he was going to assault and kill her. On some of the calls, Cindy stated it sounded like a man pleasuring himself while talking about what they wanted to do to her, and she was horrified. She didn't know what to do. On the one hand, she thought that they could be prank calls that were being done by a perverse kid in the area. Clearly, whoever this was taking some sort of satisfaction from tormenting her, and she thought that she would look a bit foolish if it happened to be a child. But on the other hand, as time went on and the calls continued, the threats became even more specific, as if the person was watching her. On October 12, 1982, about a month after seeing the man in black lurking in her neighborhood, Cindy answered the phone to once again hear her stalker on the other end. In a hushed tone, he told Cindy that he was going to get her one night soon, and terrified, she hung up. After weeks of harassment, she called the RCMP and informed them of what had been happening. They listened as she told them of the repeated calls, how the threats seemed to be escalating, and they seemed mildly sympathetic to her situation. They suggested that she keep a list of each of the calls she receives throughout the day, including innocuous ones, and write down everything that happened in the call. That way she could have a record of when the calls took place, the number attached to the calls, and more. Cindy asked the officers if there was anything else that they could do, or if they could have someone stay with her for a while just in case the person called back, but they told her no. They couldn't just station an officer with her, especially given that they had no evidence thus far that a call had even been made. The lack of response or help from the RCMP left Cindy feeling foolish, and shortly after they left, her phone rang again. Immediately, she was filled with dread. If this person had been watching her the way she believed they had been, they would have no doubt known she was by herself, and that the police had just left. Would they be mad? Would they attack? Her mind was racing as she answered the phone. "You fucking bitch, I'll get you," a male voice said through the speaker before abruptly hanging up. The next day, she received another call from the same voice. It said, "So you think calling the police will keep you safe? You wait, I've got my zipper open, I'm talking to my throbbing." Cindy hung up on him, mid-sentence, terrified of what could happen to her. She took down all the information from the calls on a pad of paper near the phone, writing down everything about the calls she was receiving. She made sure to document all that she could, so that the next time she spoke to the police, they would be able to offer her more than just friendly advice. But the next day, things would once again escalate. 2 days after her first contact with the police, Cindy called again, to state that she had heard someone lurking outside of her home on her porch, and that they had smashed her porch lights. The police arrived to find the area clear, with no sign of an apparent prowler. They searched her home, her backyard, and the neighborhood, only to find that whoever had done this had vanished without a trace. A day later, Cindy called the police again, citing that someone had thrown a rock through her window and entered the house. When the police arrived, they found Cindy frantic and obviously terrified. Whoever was doing this was getting more and more comfortable with their attacks, and she felt as if her life was truly in danger. Once more, the police searched her home, her backyard, and the neighborhood, only to find that, like before, there seemed to be nothing out of place. No one was out and about. No one was lurking in another home. It seemed that whoever was doing this to Cindy was hiding in plain sight. That same week, when Cindy went to go to sleep, she pulled back her covers and found that her pillow had been slashed with a knife. Immediately, she was filled with dread. That meant this person, whoever they were, had been in her house, potentially, when she was there. What else had they touched? What had they taken? Were they still there? Cindy once again called the police, who arrived to take her statement. With the escalating attacks on Cindy, Constable Patrick McBride began to take a closer look at the case. Patrick noted that Cindy had just gotten out of a nearly 2-decade-long relationship and was living on her own for the first time in years. She was in an incredibly vulnerable position, and it seemed likely that if anyone was attacking her, it was probably her ex-husband. Cindy told McBride that she didn't think Makepeace was capable of the abuse she was currently being subjected to, and stated that he was too busy with work to stalk her. In her statements to the police, she claimed that she was amicable with her ex-husband, and that he would never hurt her, which went against what she told friends and family. She also claimed that before she called the police, she had called Roy, and he had encouraged her to talk to the police about what was happening, telling her that she needed to get police protection. If he was behind the harassment, telling her to seek help seemed counterintuitive. He interviewed James's next-door neighbors to see if they had heard or seen anything suspicious, and luckily they had. Cindy's next-door neighbor had seen a man ominously lurking outside of James's home multiple times at various hours of the day. On one occasion, she had even seen him entering through the home's front gate. Something about the man stood out to her, but she thought, given that Cindy was newly single, he was just a gentleman friend of hers. When shown a picture of Ron Makepeace, the neighbor stated that she was 100% sure that he had not been the man she had seen lurking outside of the home. During this time, Cindy had been renting out the basement of her home to 2 different tenants for extra cash, and when questioned about the stalking, they both confirmed that when Cindy had been working at the hospital, they had noticed noises coming from the main floor. At the time, they believed that Cindy had just come home early, but with the continued attacks, they thought whoever was doing this to their landlord might have been in the home. McBride developed a personal fascination with the case and felt that he needed to protect Cindy as best he could. 2 days later, McBride showed up at Cindy's house and installed deadbolts on all her doors. He also assured her that he would keep an eye on her and promised to drop in daily to check on her. This kind of attention wasn't common for the police, but Patrick had begun to develop feelings towards Cindy and would separate with his wife because of the case. Following his separation from his wife, Patrick began to date Cindy and spent his free time in her company. Notably, whenever he was around, the calls, the harassment, and the stalking appeared to stop altogether. However, the day before Halloween, Cindy found a note on her porch that was made by pasting letters from a newspaper. The note read, "Soon, Cindy." Cindy immediately called McBride and asked him to move into her home, which he readily accepted, wanting to protect her. Strangely enough, Cindy told friends that she hadn't asked Patrick to stay with her. Rather, he had offered to stay for 2 weeks because he wanted to survey the home when he was off duty. She claimed that despite their developing relationship, him moving in was strictly professional. Shortly after moving into Cindy's home, Patrick stated that he happened upon Ron Makepeace sitting alone in his car outside of the home. Ron had brought 2 firearms with him, a handgun as well as a rifle. When asked about why he was parked in the alleyway behind Cindy's home, Ron stated that he's been patrolling the block looking for Cindy's stalker in order to protect her. Having no definitive proof that he was lying, McBride told him to leave and went back inside. When McBride moved in, Cindy stopped receiving threatening phone calls when he was in the home. It seemed that whoever was calling knew when he was around and opted to wait until she was at her most vulnerable. She also began to receive more threatening letters and images, usually left on her porch, in her windows, and under the windshield of her car. Her Her phone line had also been cut, but once again, when the police would investigate, they would find no signs of a perpetrator. After a month of living together, Cindy would ask Patrick to move out. Despite the escalating attacks and harassment, she felt as if his presence wasn't helping the situation, and after discussing it further, he agreed to leave, as long as he could keep a key to her house, just in case. She agreed to his terms, and the pair would continue to date for about a year. Unbeknownst to Cindy, in January of 1983, her phone would be tapped by police. They hoped that as the phone calls continued to roll in, they would be able to trace them to a singular location, but subsequently, every phone call was too brief to get an exact location. The closest they were able to find was the calls were coming from the outskirts of Vancouver. 6 months after the stalking began, Cindy would be attacked for the first time. On January 27, 1983, her friend and co-worker, Agnes Woodcock, arrived at her home. The two had made plans to hang out that night after work and relax. However, when Agnes knocked on the door, there was no answer. She knocked again, waiting for her friend to make her way to the door and greet her, but the home was quiet. Thinking that her friend had either forgotten or was in the bath, Agnes walked around to the back of the home, trying to find some way to let her friend know that she had arrived, but she was met with a horrific scene. She found her friend in the garage of her home, crouched low to the ground, with a nylon stocking tied firmly around her neck. Traumatized and deeply terrified, Cindy told Agnes what had happened. She stated that she had heard a knocking on the door. When she answered, a man overpowered her and forced her into her garage, where a second man was waiting. The two men strangled her, putting both sets of hands over her neck. She told Agnes that she was unsure, but she believed she had also been raped with a knife. The men also told her that if she were to report the two men to the police, they would find and kill her sister, Melanie. They told her information about Melanie that indicated they had been stalking her as well. When asked what her assailants looked like, she stated that all she could remember is that they wore white sneakers. Despite the threat against her sister, Agnes immediately called the authorities. The attack against her was taken seriously, and doctors did a full examination. Notably, despite being attacked by two full-grown men, her injuries didn't align with her story. Her neck had some redness, due to the nylon stocking that had been wrapped around it, but it wasn't bruised, indicating that whoever strangled her didn't use a large amount of force. Similarly, most of her injuries were superficial scrapes and bruises, nothing that was indicative of a large-scale attack by two assailants. And most disturbingly, there was no indication that she had been sexually assaulted with a knife. The scene didn't make sense to those who looked at it. If her stalker wanted to kill her, why had he let her live? Who was the second person working with him? And had he always been a part of the harassment? The police had more questions than they had answers, and in order to attempt to find the truth, James was asked to see a psychiatrist. However, she declined, as she feared doing so would stigmatize her. Instead, she agreed to visit a general practitioner with experience in counseling. The investigation had stalled. A lot of what Cindy was telling them stopped making sense, and they felt as if she was hiding things from them. They asked Cindy to take a polygraph test, and it came back showing that she did know more than she was saying. When the police confronted her about what she could possibly be lying about, Cindy broke down and admitted to them that she did recognize both of her attackers, but she wouldn't name them. This was endlessly frustrating for the police, who had for the past couple of months worked to try and find out who was doing this to her. They felt as if Cindy was playing a game, choosing to give them false information in order to watch them run around and then later tell them that she lied. If she knew who was doing this to her, and she was afraid that getting the police involved would lead to her friends and family being hurt, why had she gotten them involved in the first place? If she didn't think they could help, why would she call them nearly every day? And if she was scared that telling the police their name would result in retaliation, why did she think that this person would be able to know exactly what she told the police? For the men and women who spent the time helping her, hearing that she had purposely lied and withheld information was needlessly frustrating. At the same time, Cindy decided she could no longer live in the same house. The memory of her attack hung fresh on the walls, and she decided to move back with her ex-husband, hoping that he could protect her should anything happen. Roy welcomed her back into his home and seemed determined to protect her. She had kept him up to date about what was going on, and he was frustrated with the lack of police protection she was receiving. The police in charge of the investigation still believed that Roy had some part in the attacks, and that he had been threatening his ex-wife in order to scare her back into his arms. But the calls didn't cease after the move. Less than a week later, James received another threatening letter, reading, "Run, rabbit, run. I'll show you how fucking good I am. Soon, Soon, bang bang, you're dead. The house also received a plethora of disturbing calls, all from the same person, describing in graphic detail how they planned to kill her. Within 2 months, James realized she needed to move once more, as her ex hadn't been able to protect her any more than Patrick McBride had. Cindy was terrified. She had had to move 4 times in 1 year, and each time she had, this person was still able to find her. Cindy had listened to the police and hadn't shared her private information with anyone outside of her immediate family circle. And yet, still, it seemed that no matter where she went, she was greeted by her stalker. By the time summer had rolled around, Cindy was a shell of herself. Makepeace, seemingly wanting to help his ex find some sort of peace, paid for Cindy to go on a trip out of the country to visit her brother in Jakarta. He told her that he believed that the trip would be good for her, and that it was unlikely that whoever was harassing her would be able to follow her there. And it seemed that he was right. The trip had been just what she needed. In her time out of the country, she hadn't worried about who was watching her, if anyone was following her, or if she would be attacked. For the first time in months, she felt safe and like she could breathe. But unfortunately, her trip had to end. When she got back, she found a note in her home, which read, "Welcome back, death, blood, hate, etc." Due to the sheer laziness of the note, it seemed as if even her stalker was beginning to get tired. But the trip had revitalized Cindy, and she decided that she was no longer waiting like a sitting duck. She painted her car a different color, that way it would no longer be recognizable, and she changed her hair, and she started keeping a portable panic button, along with oil and pepper spray on her at all times. She also hired a private investigator, Ozzy Caban, to look into who was stalking her, as she felt that the police were no longer taking her seriously. But despite her best efforts, her stalker kept up with her. Threatening letters addressed to Cindy began to arrive at her work, and as scared as Cindy was, she tried her best to assure her coworkers that everything was fine. She claimed to some that it was just a prank, and to others, she said as long as she was in the company of others, nothing bad could happen. But with the stalker targeting her work, she began to realize how much of her life was at risk. Later that fall, Cindy arrived home to find a dead cat on her porch, along with a note that read, "You're next." This cat would be the first of 3 cats found dead on her property. 2 weeks after finding the first dead cat, Cindy's garden, which had been her only source of stress relief, had been destroyed. When she spoke to the police, they once again inquired if her ex-husband would be the one behind the harassment and destruction. But Cindy said no. Roy would never have done something like that. It simply wasn't in his nature. However, in her journals, Cindy seemed to think differently. She wrote that previously in their marriage, he had destroyed the garden that she kept in their shared home, and that her stalker destroying her garden was a telltale sign that he was obviously behind it. In November 1983, McBride visited Cindy and discovered another threatening note on her porch. In the same week, 2 more dead cats would be found in the garden, each with threatening notes attached. Every week, things seemed to escalate, but nothing near to the attempt that had been taken on her life. When police questioned Cindy as to why she believed that her stalker hadn't attacked her again and seemed content with threatening her, Cindy responded that she believed that this person, whoever they were, didn't want to kill her, at least not directly. They wanted to scare her to death. This made little sense to the police, and even less sense to the people around her, who had been watching her go through this for a year. Though her friends and family were sympathetic, many began to question her. Even the private investigator she had hired didn't fully believe her story. The attacks all seemed too perfectly timed. Cindy only got the calls when no one was around, and when her phone was bugged, all the calls ended too quickly to be traced. When her porch lights had been smashed and her windows had been broken, there was no sign of an intruder, no evidence left behind, and no one seen in the area that didn't already belong there. And most damning of all, whoever was doing this to her always seemed to get her address immediately after it was changed, despite her keeping it private. Cindy felt frustrated. She was a smart woman, and she could tell that people's sympathy for her situation was running thin. Where people had been quick to offer their condolences in the beginning, they now seemed doubtful, and she knew that some believed that she had just made the whole thing up. Caban told Cindy he was on her side, but he needed to collect concrete proof that she wasn't the one behind this. He gave her a 2-way radio to keep on herself when she was home. That way, should anything happen, he would be the first to know and potentially catch the person in the act. He He didn't think that the radios would lead to anything concrete, but on January 30th, he was awoken to strange noises coming from the radio. Immediately, he got into his car and headed over to the home. Upon entering, he found Cindy laying face down in her hallway, with a paring knife stabbed through her hand, with a note attached. The note was crafted with letters cut and pasted from a magazine, and it read, "Now you must die, cunt." When Ozzy arrived in the home, Cindy seemed to come to, like she had with the garage attack. She told Caban that the last thing she remembered was a man coming through her front gate and assaulting her. She stated that he hit her in the head with a blunt object, partially knocking her out. While she was going in and out of consciousness, Cindy claimed she saw a hypodermic needle going into her arm and recalled being injected with some form of drug that fully incapacitated her. However, like with the previous attack, the injuries didn't align with her story. A tox screen was run, only to find there was no trace of any drug in her system. Similarly, there was no needle marks anywhere on her arms. There was no sign of forced entry at the scene, and once again, it appeared as if the scene had been staged. Unlike the time before, though, Cindy was able to provide a composite sketch of what her attacker looked like, although how accurate it was remained to be seen. As Cindy had stated, she knew who her attacker was, but she just didn't want to share the information. Sensing that the police were not taking her seriously, Cindy finally told them what she believed they wanted to hear. She stated that she now fully believed her ex-husband, Roy Makepeace, was behind the attacks, and that he was trying to get her back after ending their marriage. On Valentine's Day, 1984, the police questioned Makepeace once more, and again he denied ever hurting Cindy, even in their marriage. Later on, Cindy's father, Otto, would speak to Roy one-on-one while wearing a wire. He was tired of watching his daughter be tormented, and he believed he could get the older man to admit wrongdoing. When they sat down together, Otto told him he would no longer be permitted to see Cindy, and that he knew he was behind the whole ordeal. In response, Roy told Otto that he believed that Cindy was being stalked and harassed by the mafia. He then wrote Otto a 6-page letter detailing his theory about why the mafia would be after Cindy, how she likely had disrespected a family while helping a child at the hospital, and begging him to get the police to look into this theory. Like Patrick McBride, he claimed he just wanted to help Cindy, and felt that he had cracked the code. In the months that followed, the phone calls continued, with Cindy receiving a new, explicit phone call and a note nearly every day. But once again, they were always too short to be traced. Police set up surveillance of her house, wanting to find definitive proof that she wasn't behind the attacks herself. Only Cindy knew she was being watched, and unless the culprit was affiliated with the police, they would be able to catch whoever was harassing her. As many as 14 officers were involved in the surveillance operations. During those times, nothing happened. Officers watched the home for days, but nothing. Not even a drive-by from a person who appeared to be casing the neighborhood. However, the moment officers would leave the area, Cindy would call the police, claiming to have gotten another call or a note. Cindy and her family claimed that this was done on purpose, to make it seem like she was crying wolf, but there was no way that a third party could have known that she was being surveyed or not. Police all but told her they believed that she was the one behind her own harassment, and with that in mind, Cindy became more withdrawn, believing no one could help her. On June 18, 1984, James phoned Caban in a panic, and he rushed to her house to find her hiding in her garden, claiming someone had broken in. Caban went into the home, and James stayed behind him, scared of what he would find. The pair walked down into the basement, where they found James's dog, Heidi, cowering in the corner. The dog had been abused, had a noose tied around its neck, and was frightened of both her owner and the private eye. Attached to the noose was a note, reading "Happy Birthday," along with multiple pornographic photos. Over the following weeks, the harassment continued, with Cindy getting more calls and threatening letters. Another dead cat was found, but shockingly, on July 1st, 2 men came to her home, posing as police officers. Cindy was immediately suspicious, as she knew nearly every cop in the area due to her ongoing case. Before letting either man inside, Cindy told them she was going to radio Caban for help, and the 2 men bolted immediately. Unsurprisingly, no proof of this interaction happens to exist, besides Cindy's insistence that it did. 2 days later, Cindy told Caban over the two-way radio that she was going to take Heidi for a walk. He told her that she shouldn't go alone, given her circumstances, but she insisted that she needed fresh air. 3.5 hours later, she knocked on a stranger's door, about a mile away from her home. She appeared to be badly injured, with a black nylon stocking knotted around her neck, and collapsed as soon as they opened the door. According to Cindy, while she was walking Heidi, a green van pulled up next to her. Inside was a bearded man and a blonde woman whom she had never seen before. The man asked her for directions, and after that, she couldn't remember anything. She was immediately taken to the hospital, and despite having 2 needle marks in her arm, indicating that she might have been drugged, the tox screen showed that the only drug in her system was an antidepressant medication she started taking. Oddly enough, while James was being treated, the hospital receptionist informed authorities that she had received a strange phone call earlier, inquiring about the hospital's securities policies. The call alarmed her, and she immediately thought whoever was on the other end was up to no good. The police then played the receptionist a recording they had taken of Ron Makepeace, and she claimed, quote, that there was a strong possibility that he had been the one who called, unquote, although she couldn't say for sure. In an effort to get more information out of his client, Caban suggested that Cindy undergo hypnotherapy. The therapist ultimately determined that Cindy was too traumatized for hypnotherapy to work, but only after Cindy claimed that she had witnessed a double murder at some point in her life. Despite this small hiccup, Caban still believed that hypnotherapy would help find out more about the people attacking James, and pushed her to go again in the new year. It was at the second hypnotherapist that James stated that she had witnessed a double homicide that had been done by her ex-husband, Ron Makepeace. She told the police, Caban and her hypnotherapist, that in 1981, prior to her divorce, they had gone sailing near Thormanby Island. She was irritable, as she hated sailing and had a fear of drowning, and her irritability made Ron angry. So angry that he murdered a young couple, dismembered their bodies with an axe, and then threw their bodies overboard. Ron had spotted her during the murder, and in his rage, smeared blood across her face using one of the victims' severed limbs. Their bodies eventually washed ashore in the following year, and Cindy had been so traumatized from the event that her mind had forced her to forget that it ever happened. And, as most of you are probably expecting, this double murder on a boat never happened. It is true that a year before their divorce, Roy and Cindy had been sailing by Thormanby Island, but they were not alone on that trip. Cindy's sister had been traveling with them, and according to her, she saw nothing suspicious. Similarly, when looking into police records, they found that there had been no reports of a young couple who went missing from the area, and no body parts had ever washed ashore. It was clear that this story was not real, and was either an implanted memory created by a hypnotist or a delusion that Cindy believed was real. In late June 1985, James was involuntarily committed after having attempted suicide by overdosing on prescription drugs, though later she said she had not intended to kill herself. After being released, Cindy asked the police to tap her phone, as she was determined to get Makepeace to reveal himself to them. She had become even more convinced of his guilt, following her revelation that he had killed 2 people in front of her, and she told the police that she would get himself to own up to his actions. When Cindy called Ron, she told him everything, how she remembered him killing 2 people in front of her, how he had been abusive during their marriage, and how he was the only one doing everything to her now. She claimed that her previous descriptions of her assailants had all been him in disguise, and she knew that he was the one behind it all of which James denied. He told Cindy that she was insane, that she had lost herself in a revenge fantasy, and that he had never killed anyone, much less dismembered a young couple on a boat. But Cindy wouldn't listen. She told him that she knew it was him, and she was going to get proof, at which point Ron told her not to contact him again, unless she wanted to go to court. In the following weeks, the police decided to monitor Ron closely, and found that while his ex was still getting harassing phone calls and letters every day, he was going about his life as usual. He seemed exceptionally ordinary, and surveillance was ultimately called off after a week, when nothing unusual was observed. On August 5th, 1985, Cindy would call emergency services, this time reporting a fire had been set at her home. When the fire department arrived, they found that newspaper had been scattered around the floor of one of the rooms of her home, but the house itself had not caught on fire. It appeared that someone had attempted to set the home ablaze, and had simply failed. They were able to extinguish the fire easily, and went along with their day. However, a day later, they would return to the home, finding the same scenario. The responding officers believed that Cindy, being the only person residing in the home, had been the one who tried to start the fires. Like the prior assaults, there was no evidence that anyone had broken in, and nothing appeared to be out of place. However, those two fires seemed to be the prelude to what was to come next. On August 21st, another fire broke out in the home, and this time it caught on. Earlier that night, around 3:15 a.m., Cindy decided that she needed to take Heidi for a walk and left the home, completely unbothered by the fact that last time she had gone for a walk, she had been kidnapped and attacked. Her stalker had apparently witnessed her leaving, and instead of attacking her, broke into the home and set another fire, and then left, all without leaving a mark on any of the windows. The door was still locked from when Cindy had left, and there were no signs of break-in or disruption after the blaze had been set, and as they had found previously, the fire was started using newspaper spread out on the floor. It was determined, following an investigation, that James had been the one to set the fire. In the fall of 1985, Dr. Anthony Marcus, a psychologist, was requested by Carol Halliday of the RCMP to conduct interviews with James and experiment with various case files. Halliday felt James was lying and orchestrating her attacks, and that the various male officers who investigated them for her had been conned by the histrionics of a pretty woman. She thought it was obvious that Cindy was lying, but because Caban and McBride had been attracted to her, they believed her. After studying the case and speaking with Cindy, Marcus stated that he believed she might have been suffering from dissociative identity disorder and was hurting herself without realizing it. He posited the reason why her hysteria was so believable was because it was real. Since she had no recollection of hurting herself, she lived every day in fear. In December 1985, Cindy decided to move once more, this time to Richmond. She had only just moved in when she was found lying in a ditch 6 miles from her house. Once more, she had no idea how she got there and appeared to be drugged. A nylon stocking was wrapped tightly around her neck, which seemed to be the stalker's calling card. She was only wearing a man's work boot on one foot and a single glove. Her whole body was covered in bruises and cuts, and by the time she was found, hypothermia had set in. After this attack, Cindy once again left the country to visit family. She needed to leave the area to be at peace, and notably, while she was gone, she wasn't attacked. Her brother tried to get her to stay with him, to stay in the country and not to go back, but Cindy seemed determined. Agnes Woodcock and her husband Tom began to spend the night with her in order to make her feel safe. She had stopped eating and taken care of herself, and told the couple repeatedly she would rather be dead than continue living. On April 16, 1986, while the couple were spending the night, Cindy woke them, stating that she had heard a commotion in the house. Upon investigating, they found another fire had been started in the basement. They attempted to call the fire department, but found the phone line had been cut. When they went outside to get help, Tom claimed to see an unknown man standing on the street watching the fire, but when he approached the man, he fled. At this point, Cindy was convinced her ex-husband was behind the fire. She went to the police and directly accused Ron of being the one behind all of the attacks and the abuse. She said she knew it was him from the beginning, and she lied in order to protect him. There was only one issue. Ron wasn't in the country, and he hadn't been for a while. He had decided to travel back to South Africa, and couldn't have possibly been behind the attacks. The police had also been tailing him while she had received certain calls, meaning that there was no way he could have been behind everything, or if he was, he had help. Alan Connolly, a psychiatrist who had been treating James since January 1983, met with her and stated that, though he had long believed her allegations of harassment, he feared she was suicidal. Connolly had her committed to the psychiatric ward of St. Paul's Hospital for 2 weeks, and they found that she was suffering from anorexia and depression. While in the psych ward, Cindy wrote the following in her journal: "I still feel suicide is my best option in an unbearable situation, and as soon as I get out of here, I'll carry out my plan." However, over the 10 weeks she was committed, her mental health improved tremendously. Surprisingly, when she was released, life seemed to improve. She was no longer being called or finding threatening notes every time she went outside. She continued to go to therapy and told her therapist that she was beginning to feel like herself again. By September, she had bought her own home and was planning to go back to work in October. However, after immediately returning to work, she was fired. The hospital viewed her and her mental health crisis as a liability and let her go. She eventually found a new job at Richmond General Hospital in August of 1987, nearly a year later, but unfortunately, the harassment would also begin again. In August, she reported that someone had tried to break into her home through a broken window. 3 days later, she called the police and reported that her front light bulbs had been loosened, Every week, she called the police, citing a new incident, and claimed that once again she was being targeted by an unknown entity. A month later, Roy received two strange messages on his answering machine, which sounded like a woman trying to disguise their voice. This was the first message. The second message stated, "More smack, more downstairs, another grand after we waste the cunt. No more deal," which made it appear that whoever the caller was, they were planning to kill Cindy because Roy had paid them to. Makepeace immediately gave the answering machine messages to his attorneys, as he no longer trusted the police. Cindy, feeling scared and alone, talked to her sister and told her that she felt as if she was going crazy. She claimed that all the drugs she had been given during the attacks had damaged her brain, and that she couldn't differentiate between what was real and what wasn't. Once again, she went to the police and told them that she believed that her ex-husband was the one who had been attacking her. She claimed he was trying to systematically break her down and destroy her psyche, and that as a psychiatrist, he would be more than able to do so. Once again, she spoke to Ron via a tapped phone call, and once more, he denied having anything to do with the attacks. He told her that he had moved on with his life and that he wanted to be left alone. But Cindy wouldn't accept that answer. After he hung up, he had his attorney contact the police, and they gave him the recordings that had been left on his answering machine. Immediately, the police believed that Cindy had left the messages, trying to make her ex look guilty. 2 weeks later, Cindy was attacked once more. She was found unconscious in her car, naked from the waist down. She was hogtied and, as had always been the case, had a black nylon stocking wrapped around her neck. She claimed that she had been attacked while getting out of the car, but had no memory as to what happened. Notes and phone calls once again became a nearly daily occurrence, with her co-workers finding notes meant for her scattered around the hospital. Following the break-in attempt in her home, the police deployed scent hounds to try and track whoever was in the area. However, the hounds were unable to pick up any scent. But a little over a month later, Cindy would be attacked for the last time. At 4 p.m., James went to Richmond General Hospital to pick up her paycheck. While there, she conversed with a few coworkers, who later claimed she was in good spirits, as she stated she hadn't experienced any unusual activity. She told them she was hopeful that the stalking had stopped for good this time, although she doubted it. She had plans that night to have an infrared security system installed in the house, not unlike ones used in bank vaults. And after that, Agnes and Tom Woodcock were set to come over to spend the night. After getting her check, she went to pick up groceries, then to deposit her check at the Bank of Montreal. However, after leaving the bank at 7:59 p.m., she would seemingly vanish into thin air. Agnes and Tom arrived at her house at 10 p.m., but found that Cindy's car was missing, and it appeared that no one was home. They were able to talk to her downstairs roommate, who she had gotten to feel safer at home, and they told the couple that she had left earlier to do some grocery shopping and she hadn't come back. Scared that something had happened to their friend, they drove to the shopping center she was known to frequent, and it was there that they found her car abandoned in the parking lot. Blood was visible inside the car on the driver's side door, as well as groceries and a wrapped birthday gift for her friend's young son. Contents from James's wallet were found lying underneath the vehicle, and it appeared that a struggle had taken place. Immediately, the couple reported Cindy as missing, and a large-scale search was underway. Due to her extended history with the police, they felt that she was likely under extreme duress, and her photo was widely circulated. It would be 2 weeks before she was found, and when she was, the worst was confirmed. Her body was found in the yard of an abandoned house, just over a mile from where her car was. The home itself was situated on a busy street, and though it was abandoned, the house got a lot of foot traffic, as teenagers would often use the home to throw parties during the warmer months. However, over the past couple weeks, no one had come to the home. The house had recently been spray painted with the words, "Some bitch died here," written in orange, encircling the area that her body was found. She had suffered a brutal beating, and her hands and legs were tied behind her back. Her hands had been bound so tightly that one finger had scratched another down to the bone, trying to loosen the restraints. She was fully dressed, but had no shoes on. Her feet were clean, which meant it was unlikely that she had walked there. And as always, a black nylon stocking was tied around her neck. There was a small pin prick on her right inner elbow, indicating that she had been pricked with a needle, and unlike every other time, James was found to have drugs in her system. toxicology report showed that she had 10 times the lethal dose of morphine, along with diazepam and flurazepam in her system. Surprisingly, based on all the information that was available to the RCMP, it was suspected that her death was likely an intentional suicide or an accidental one. They believed, based on the 7 years of stalking and attacks, that she had accidentally taken a lethal amount of drugs, placed herself in a high-traffic area, and believed that she would be found quick enough to survive. However, that wasn't the case. Her friends and family were horrified at this conclusion. They felt that the police were not taking their job seriously, and instead simply calling Cindy hysterical. They believed that her death only showcased how bad the stalking had been, and even in death, the justice system ignored all facts and evidence. They told the police that it was clear who killed her, Ron Makepeace, but they didn't want to look into it. In 1990, an extensive inquest into James's death started. An inquest is a judicial inquiry into common law jurisdictions, particularly one held to determine the cause of a person's death. And since the family felt so strongly that what had occurred in this instance was a murder, the police wanted to make sure that they had done their job sufficiently before closing the book on the case. The inquest itself lasted 40 days and was the longest, most expensive inquest at the time. During the inquest, many shocking allegations came to light, not least of which was Ron Makepeace, alleging his ex-wife had been sexually and physically abused throughout her childhood. Ron stated that during his marriage to James, she told him that her father had abused her tremendously and that one of her brothers had sexually exploited her. Oftentimes, when he would ask her about her childhood and try to connect with her, she would grow angry and violent, something that was confirmed by multiple psychiatrists she went to throughout her life. It was also revealed that, shortly after James's death, her parents uncovered a hoard of various medications in her home. This concluded the medications she had overdosed on. Fearful that their daughter's death would be labeled a suicide, the family flushed the medication down the toilet and vowed to never speak of it again. Cindy's younger sister, Melanie, had also found a glass cutter, medical syringe, a urinary catheter, and a saline solution in her sister's bedroom after her death. These items had all seemingly been used in past attacks. Psychiatrists she had seen over the years also testified and reported that they believed that Cindy was deeply mentally unwell. Dr. Paul Termanson testified that he believed that James suffered from hysterical personality disorder. Dr. Wesley Friesen stated that he believed that she suffered from borderline personality disorder with elements of PTSD. Friesen elaborated on his claims, stating that Cindy had a tremendous amount of rage towards her father and believed that there was a strong likelihood that her father had sexually abused her when she was a child, although she never stated that outright. Other experts were brought in to showcase how Cindy would have been able to bind herself in each of the attacks, and others discussed how long she would have been conscious for while taking the drugs. After 40 days of expert testimony, the jury was unable to determine what killed Cindy James. On one hand, it was possible that she had done everything herself. However, given the state of her body, believing that she would have put herself through such duress seemed impossible. But at the same time, it was clear that Ron Makepeace, one of the only suspects, couldn't have been behind every attack. He had been out of the country and under surveillance when some of the biggest attacks had taken place, and whoever was responsible for part of it had to be responsible for all of it. It was ultimately ruled that James had died of an unknown event, and the case was formally closed. The RCMP estimated that they spent over $1.5 million, but found little to no evidence of actual stalking. Because of this, many who have looked into this case believe that Cindy did everything herself. Now I offer the question to you. What do you think happened here? Do you think that Cindy did everything herself? Do you think she was being stalked? And if so, by who? Many have inferred that if she was being stalked, the person would have tried to work with the police so as to know when she was being surveyed. But let me know what you think in the comments down below. As always, if there's a video you would like to see me cover on this channel, email me at dreading.official@gmail.com. I hope you have a good day and remember to stay safe.